Hello and welcome to Tell Muses, our podcast all about storytelling with storytellers, for storytellers, all about storytelling, the art of storytelling stories. And today, Despina and I are really, really glad that we can welcome on the podcast Julian Burnell. Welcome, Julian.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really pleased to be here.
We're very glad to have you here, Julian. So Simona is in Italy, I am in Greece, and you're in the UK, right?
That's right. Yes, I'm right in the middle of the UK, just south of Stratford-on-Avon, looking out over some rather grey but still quite pretty countryside today.
Awesome. I wish I were there, to be honest. We normally start this by asking our guest teller, could you please tell for our international audience who Julian Burnell is?
Oh, right. Well, I am a father, a husband, a storyteller. I've lived in the UK all my life. I grew up mostly along the south coast with an absolute fascination from a very early age for folklore in particular, and stories and legends and history, and where they all cross into each other, if you like. So where a story comes from being folklore, and where folklore comes from legend, and from where legend comes from history, and how it all starts. Now, we're very lucky in this country that there is a real passion for history. I think that every single sort of square foot of British countryside that has any historical significance at all has some kind of marker. Like if you look on a map, you'll say, right, there was a battle here, and there's a castle here, and there's some ancient field systems here, all stuff like that. And because of that, there's this huge upwelling of folklore about what happened there in the past, and then that translates into legend, myth, and stories. I think I sort of just dived into the whole mix of all those different kinds of stories and realized that I enjoyed telling other people about those things and sharing that information with them, which is how I ended up telling stories as a hobby. I think it's always a fascinating hobby to have, and yeah, I really get on with it still.
It's wonderful, Julian. And I always ask our guests, so how did your passion for storytelling start? But I think you've already answered that question.
Yeah, well, I think yes, I kind of have, and I think yes, it is because I was always fascinated by these kinds of stories from a very early age. I don't know why. I don't know what it was. My parents weren't especially interested in that sort of thing. Neither were my friends. It was, I think the single thing that ignited my passion for folklore, and I know a lot of people will mention this, is actually a book that was published by the Reader's Digest Company in about 1972 or three, called Folklore, Myths and Legends of Britain. And it isn't in print now, and individual copies go for sort of several £100. But it's like a gazetteer of all of England, well, Britain's folklore, I should say, because it includes Scotland and Wales. It's a huge gazetteer, and there are so many stories in that. And I think that, if anything, is not only the one book that I would save from a fire if my house was burning down, but the one thing which, more than anything else, made me think about the individual stories that are in the places that were right around me that I was living in, not just over the hills and far away, but in the actual environment I was occupying day by day. And then you kind of see beyond what's been built on it, the farms, the roads, the houses, and you see what used to be, and those stories are still there.
Sounds like a folklore encyclopedia, actually, right?
Yes, absolutely. And you'll still see people who are interested in sort of folk history and folk horror and all these sorts of and folk tales and myths and legends. They always will reference this one particular book. It's amazing they don't bring it back into print, because I'm sure it would sell terribly, terribly well.
Do you think anyone could have access to this book through some online source, maybe?
I don't know. I haven't seen it. Put it like that. I certainly, as I say, you can pick up second-hand copies, although they're not cheap. And so I think some libraries may have them. It's certainly worth hunting around for it. But I mean, it's not always accurate, this particular book. There are one or two things in it which make me smile. For example, in the far west of Cornwall, there's a stone circle. Well, it's an arrangement of standing stones called Men and Toll, and it's particularly distinctive because it has a huge stone ring. Basically, it's standing up on its edge, and it's about, I don't know, 4 or 5 feet high with a hole in the middle of it. So absolutely remarkable thing to visit, which in the book is described as the entrance to a burial complex. And it's like, no, that's, if you ever go to it, it's like, no, this was never ever the entrance to a burial complex. This is just a stone with a hole in it. You don't crawl through that. It's far too small. So there are things like that which do make you smile. But at the same time, it's still it is worth finding out if you're at all interested in British folklore, myths and legends. As I say, it's called Folklore, Myths and Legends of Britain. I've got a copy. I'm not giving it up. Sorry.
There's no need, but perhaps you should insurance book have some insurance on it. You know?
I think I probably should. Yes, I probably should get it insured. Yes, as a separate item on my policy.
So maybe the Gutenberg project might have a copy. There's a lot of material in there, a lot of content.
It's possible. It's possible. Yes, I've never actually, because I've got access to the thing physically, and because I've been reading it for the last sort of 40 years. I know it so well. I've never actually thought to look for its content online. Don't get me wrong, I don't think there's anything that's exclusive to it which isn't actually listed in terms of the actual stories and the local folklore like that of Britain. But this one single tome, I don't know if it's actually listed online anywhere, but I'll certainly have a look.
I'll have a look. Thanks for your suggestion. So I have a question for you, Julian. You know, Simona, I met Julian in person once when I had a gig in Birmingham with the Trad Arts group. And I think, Julian, you're part of that group now, aren't you?
Yes, I am. Yeah, I've sort of attached myself, whether they like it or not, to the crew at the Birmingham Storytelling Cafe, which happens once a month in Birmingham. And if anybody's interested in them, they can be found online. But yes, they're a fascinating group of guys. There's all sorts of different aspects of story that come out in their evenings. I think, you know, on the evening that you were there, Despina, you were the sort of the headline act, as it were, and the rest of us did our other little stories in the first half. And I think one of the things I really like about an evening like that is because it shows you different styles of storytelling and different perspectives on storytelling. You know, we've got a lot of different people who tell stories in very different styles from very different backgrounds, that sort of thing. And it's really good, I think, to immerse yourself in that, because, you know, it's taken me a long time to find a style of storytelling which I call mine. And to be perfectly honest with you, I don't really think I'm there yet. But at the same time, it's always fascinating to watch other storytellers, as many of them as you can, to see, oh, that's interesting, they do that, and okay, that works for them, wouldn't work for me, and stuff like that. And you know, if you want to up your game and make your storytelling better, then I think that's, you know, it's something that is really valuable. And of course, it's just a really, really fun evening just to hang around with friends and tell some stories.
It was indeed. And okay, here's a secret among artists in any kind of art. The way we create a personal style is by copying other things we like. Of course, everybody does that. Yes. They do it in every kind of art. Painters do it, singers do it, musicians do it, writers do it. This is how you do it. You take things you like and you make this kind of personal puzzle. You try out things. With trial and error, humanity evolves. So some things work, others don't. You'll never know until you try. So we try things and find out what works for us. And this is how we create our personal style. And I think this is a never-ending process. It just keeps on and on. You know, even when you're in your comfort zone, you've conquered this art, you've mastered what you like to do. Even then, there are still things you can take out and things you can put in. Always, it never stops.
Yeah, absolutely.
By
And I
the
think
way,
I think I think that's there's a lovely parallel in actual fact to that with the stories themselves. Because we had a storytelling evening. The most recent one was just a couple of days ago, and I told a story which is known as the cow who ate the piper, which I won't tell here because it's a bit long, but it's quite a well-known story, and it's also told as a song. Um, but I added a bit on at the end because which was in the version that I'd heard from it. Now, I had heard it from a very famous storyteller in the UK called Taffy Thomas, who is the storyteller laureate. So he's sort of like story. Taffy Thomas is kind of the one we all look up to in many ways. But the actual storyteller who was there at the time, doing the sort of the main second half performance, a guy called Jason Buck. I was talking to him afterwards, and he said, "Yeah, he knows that story, but he also knows the evolution of it, which is that where the original story has a particular extra bit at the ending, which Taffy only added on after he was telling it to some school children, and they picked up something that had happened earlier in the story and said." Oh, what about adding this little bit on at the end? What happened there? And he had to make that up, and then he added it into his story. So it's exactly the same. We none of us as storytellers actually tell original stories, if you like. We pick up the stories with reverence. I think it's important to have a degree of respect for the stories you're telling, but we pick them up and we pass them on. We give them our own little twist, and if people want to keep that, fine. If not, then not. But the stories are kind of alive in many ways, and they exist outside of us. I think back when I was sort of learning stories, the storytelling, one of the things that was made very clear is that a storytelling has three parts. There is the audience, there is the teller, but there is also the story, and those are the three elements, if you like, and they are inextricably linked, but they are also separate from each other.
I love
And
that
that
I love that you said that, Julian, because what I have come to notice among these three angles of a triangle is that among different tellers, you can see which one is the most important for each individual teller. For some, it is the teller, it is themselves. For some, it is the audience. They address the audience, they see what it needs. If the audience is getting bored, if the audience needs more entertainment, they customize the story to the audience's needs. And for some, it's just the story. The storyteller is just a channel through which the story passes to the audience. And to me, personally, that is the magic, because if you just let the story flow, the audience will follow. You don't need to make the story. This is my personal perspective. You don't need to change the story to address the mood of the audience, let us put it that way. You
Yeah,
can do it if it's a professional gig, if they are paying you to do that. They are paying you for entertainment. If it's kids, if it's people who want to have fun, if there is one specific purpose to it, you can address the prerequisites. But if it's not, for me, the utmost respect must go to the story.
yes, I think I agree, and I think I suppose I've tended to feel that there's a need to have the balance. In the ideal, in the perfect situation, there's the sort of the perfect balance between the three. But yes, ultimately, I think you're right. The story is always first among equals at the very least, because that's why you're there. If you like. Otherwise, it's just a group of people in a room. It's the story itself that creates that special setting and that special atmosphere, that special cast to the event, and that's what
Also,
distinguishes
we
it.
are not actors. We're not actors. This is a
No,
different kind of performing. If you're a storyteller, you are not in the spotlight. It's not about you. Yeah, people should remember that. I think it's
Yes,
really important.
absolutely, absolutely, and yes, there's a difference, I think, between refining your craft as much as possible and trying to sort of be the center of attention. You're right. It's not about you. It's about the story.
Yeah. And I did meet Taffy Thomas in Marrakesh in 23.
Oh,
He's there
lucky you.
again this year, right now, as we speak. They're all there. Not us, unfortunately. Hopefully next time.
Yeah,
And we are having Jason back here in a later episode also, which is pretty
excellent.
cool. Yeah.
Yeah, Jason's great, and I think that's the other thing that really struck me, and particularly where Jason is concerned, and where a lot of other storytellers are concerned, is the differing degrees to which you bring the physical elements and how much you project your body into it. And there is no right way of doing it, because I think, my experience of watching Jason tell is that he's quite physical, and his movements and his gestures and his stances all contribute to the way he tells a story. Whereas if you look at somebody like Maria Cradali, her system of storytelling, it feels a lot less physical. I mean, most of the time when I've seen her, she tends to tell when she's just sitting down, and this diminutive woman with this very soft voice, nevertheless, without physically dominating an area, completely captivates the room. It's little short of miraculous. Um, and and then there are others. There's a Daniel Norden is another storyteller I saw a few weeks ago, and without doing much in the way of what feels like physical movement, I've seen him completely occupy a really large stage all by himself, without what you would consider dramatic gestures or anything like that. So that physical side of it is another completely variable element, which can go in any way, but it has to suit you. Otherwise, it's just going to feel wrong to you and to the audience.
And this is why we try different styles. We try out different things.
Absolutely.
Now that we blew my friend Jason's trumpet, what do you call it? Blew his horn?
Yes,
What's the expression?
that's the one. Yeah, blowing
It must
his
have been
trumpet for it. Yeah.
horn at some time in the past, I'm sure. Anyway, now that we said that about Jason's physicality, well, he is a large bloke, yeah, he occupies a lot of space anyway, so he doesn't need to move much, which he does, but you can see him transform into a troll, for example, very clearly. By the way, I can see the same thing about you, Julian. When I heard you tell that night in Birmingham, I think you moved, your physicality was very in accordance with your telling. So you did tell an Irish story that night. Do you have any connection to the Irish?
Not really. I did my family tree a few years ago, and if you only have to go back about 3 generations, and there's a strong Irish strand in it. I have all these Hannigan ancestors who go back many years. But yeah, I don't have any particular connection with that. I just find that I think that it's interesting the way different stories have been preserved through different parts of the British Isles, and I think this is the thing, that that stories were much more respected. And I don't know, this isn't based on any historical research, so don't take this as gospel, but this is just my perception. It feels like if you go back sort of 100 years or so, you'll find that there is a much greater respect for the oral tradition of storytelling in the Celtic fringe, we might call it, of Great Britain, and in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, and in Ireland itself, than there is in most of England. And again, England is not a particularly large country, but it's very diverse. So again, I think you'd find a lot of variation in England. But I think I think the best way I can sum it up is when I went to buy, because I have a huge library of books of folklore and fairy tales and stories and things like that. If you look at the sort of the reprints of stories or sort of Scottish folk tales and fairy tales, and put that beside from say a book that was published 100 years ago originally and has been reprinted, and put that next to a book of English folk tales and fairy tales, you'll find that the English fairy tales are quite clearly aimed at children in a way that the Scottish ones are not. You know, it's clearly the case that in England, the process of a fairy tale as something which is only for children was much more advanced at that time. And I think that going back to your question about Ireland and places like that, I think part of the reason that I find those stories so fascinating is because when I started researching stories and folklore, I found that they had more interesting and more developed stories for which were clearly aimed at a more mature adult audience, in a way that some of the English stories weren't. Now, as I've got further into it, I've obviously found that actually there are some English stories which don't fit that category at all. You know, there's some English stories which are very much about history, very much about adult themes, and that doesn't necessarily mean sex and violence, but you get the idea. But it's interesting, and I think the reason that I found that particular story so much fun was because of the slight sort of the wink of the humor and that kind of thing that was in it. So I think the reason that I found the sort of, if we might call them the Celtic stories, that much more interesting was because of that. They had that slightly greater emphasis on more complex story, shall we say.
Yes, they did. And in fact, Simona and I had Maria Gillen here just the other day, who is a fourth generation Irish storyteller. And she's been telling us how much they were, it was like in their DNA, let's say. Yeah. So it was either to children or adult audience, the stories were addressed. I think the reason why most folktales are addressed to children must have to do with the Grimm fairy tales. I mean, there was a huge Germanic influence upon the English, and as the Grimms took the European tales and transformed them to fit children's audiences, I think it influenced the whole atmosphere of that era concerning storytelling. What do you think, Simona?
I was actually thinking that nowadays, Julian, both Despina and I are English teachers. So, for example, I started telling stories in my lessons, and then I got from there, and now I tell also outside of the class. But what I found, particularly at the beginning of my career as a storyteller, and particularly in language teaching, is that I always had to fight with people, say, oh no, storytelling is not just for children. And I would say, no, I can tell stories to my teenage students, I can tell stories to my adult students. And I also had to fight, I mean, with the management, telling them, no, it's not just for children. I don't want to tell stories just to children. There are so many techniques and things that and stories that I can use with the adults as well. And one thing that I was thinking now is that two things actually. So nowadays, at least here, I think one of the things that um, changed how we see folktales, for example, is Disney. So Disney movies and how they changed some of the folktales. Just imagine the Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen, and how they changed the ending. At the end of the original story, she I think she she dies, or she
It doesn't end
loses her,
well.
she
Yeah.
cuts her legs. So something very grim. And and
Yeah.
and also, yes, all the other stories. I mean, also Little Red Riding Hood, for example,
Mm,
to think about one. Now to children we tell the story of the hunter that comes and kills the big bad wolf, and he cuts the belly of the wolf, and oh, surprise, surprise, Little Red Riding Hood and Granny are still alive in the belly of the big bad wolf. But in the
mm,
original story that our ancestors used to tell, they we don't have that. And I think that, for example, in England, a lot of these purification, if I can call it like that,
mm.
comes in the Victorian age,
Yes.
and yeah, and
Yeah,
the fact
absolutely.
that, yeah, you changed
I
the
think
whole
it's
society.
I think we tend to blame Disney for that, and I think that that's fair up to a point. But at the same time, I think the process, you're right, started with Victorian mores in England more than anything else. Because I think the thing you made a very good point about Red Riding Hood. Because of course the thing is that once those tales are taken across the channel and into England, the big bad wolf is an entirely fictional creature. Up until there are still wild wolves in Central Europe, and there have been forever. But whereas the last wolf in Britain was killed 800-900 years ago, so automatically, when a Grimm's fairy tale about the big bad wolf comes to Britain, it becomes that much more removed from reality. There are no big bad wolves out there in the wool in the forest. They don't exist anymore. They're extinct. So if you like that, there's that automatic, unconscious sanitization of a story from something which actually might make people sort of look out the window into the dark ball, and the kind of sort of slight tingle of the ghost story by the fire, but not something that's actually going to have any kind of lesson, if you like. And that, I think, is where that that sort of reduction in the not necessarily in the relatability of the story tale, but the fairy tale, but possibly just in that removal from reality by that little extra degree.
Well, we know that when we listen to stories such as these, the very old folk tales, as adults, we know that it's not an actual wolf, it's a metaphor, right? Of
Mm,
course, actual wolves were a threat to humanity for many, many years. So there is that aspect of it as
yes.
well. But we can see what they mean by a wolf. So, Julian, you said earlier to yourself that you wouldn't tell that story because it's a bit long. Just so you know, we have no problem with long stories here. So you choose whichever story serves you. And I have had the pleasure of hearing you. Simona has not had it yet. So would you please give us a story?
I will indeed. It would be my pleasure. Yeah. Well, now, Despina, you actually asked for said that if I had any star stories, that would be good. But I do have stories about the stars, but they all are related. When I was looking over them, thinking about them in my mind, they're all related to Greek mythology, which, being your particular field of expertise, I didn't want to tread on your toes. So, and I did find one which is I liked because it's so very, very different, and it actually comes from the Kono region of Sierra Leone in West Africa. And when I heard it, it was called The Basket of Darkness. And the story goes, long, long ago, the world was bathed in continuous light. There was light all day from the sun, and even when the sun set, it bounced its golden rays off the moon, and the silver rays bathed the whole world, reflected from the moon. There was no night, no darkness anywhere. And God wanted to imbue the earth with another special atmosphere. So he created darkness. and he put it in a basket, and he sent it to the moon, saying that it would be the moon's gift and the moon's own particular gift to disperse when she felt like it or when she did not. So sometimes the moon would give darkness, sometimes the moon would sit in the daytime sky and bring the darkness later. Now, to transport this basket from himself to the moon, he chose Bat, because Bat was the greatest flyer of anybody. And he summoned her, and she was very pleased and excited and proud to have been given this terribly important task to carry this special basket all the way through the sky from God to the moon. And what's there, God explained, she should give it to the moon and say that God himself would come along to tell the moon what she should do with it and how she should use it. And so Bat set off on this terribly important task with the basket slung around her neck, flying furiously towards the moon. But it was a long, long way. And so, of course, she became tired and she became hungry. And she stopped for a rest and took the basket off her back and laid it down. And as she went off to find some food, other animals came up to the basket and they looked at it and snuffled at it and didn't recognize what the smell was. And they looked at it and wanted to know, because of course they were always hungry, they thought it might be food. So they opened it just as Bat was coming back. And the basket opened and the darkness started to stream out just as Bat returned. And she jumped onto the basket and chased the animals away, sent them all off to the far distances of the forest and said, "Go, you mustn't do this." But the darkness was already out. It had seeped out and it was covering the land. Now, Bat tried to gather it back. She flapped her wings furiously to waft it back into the basket, but to no avail. And by the time the moon was gone and the sun rose, she was exhausted, and so she slept. And when she awoke, the sun was setting. And she took to the skies again, tried to flap the darkness back into the basket so she could finish her task. But it was a hopeless endeavor. And although she attempts this every night, she never succeeds. And that's why the bats, even to this day, sleep all the way through the daytime and wake up at night, flapping their wings as fast as they can to waft the darkness back into Bat's basket.
Oh, that's so nice. Thank you, Julian. I will tell this to my daughter. She doesn't like bats much, so perhaps she will change her mind.
It's a lovely little story, and it's quite, and as I say, it's quite short, but it's I really liked it because most of the stories you get about night are about how people find the light and how the light was brought to Earth, and stories about Prometheus and things like that. But the fact that this was about darkness being the new thing coming out of nowhere, I thought was so different. I just it's one of those stories they just jump onto you and don't let go. And that was one of the ones which it insisted on being told.
Very peculiar, because normally I love creation stories, as you do, obviously. But normally the ones we find are the ones with light bringing instead of darkness. So that was, weird.
Yes,
And
it was.
I would have liked to listen to a Greek myth, just so you know. It's not like because I like telling them, I don't like hearing them from other people. So I do not have exclusivity, nor would I like to. But it was really nice to hear a story from Sierra Leone. I don't think I ever heard one before.
No, and that's the thing. It's actually it's something which I think I sort of actively try to do, which is that trying to find stories from places that don't get as much storytelling, if you like, and Africa is one of them. And there is this incredibly rich vein of storytelling, this enormous resource of African story. I mean, we say Africa, but of course Africa is a continent, so there is every different story under the sun, as you can imagine, and they all have different styles. When I was young at primary school, I was quite fortunate because at a particular point, for some reason, there was quite a lot of focus about the stories of Anansi, the spider god.
Right.
And I don't know why. It's quite surprising. I think it was part of sort of radical progressive politics or teaching in 1970s 1970s British teaching. I don't know, but I'm very grateful for it, because otherwise I wouldn't have heard some of these stories and become interested in African mythology and African folklore, which, as I say, is incredibly diverse, incredibly broad, has some fantastic stories of sorts like that one, the Basket of Darkness, which I've never heard anything like before. And yeah, it's really worth investigating and finding more about. And I think you gain quite an interest. You can sometimes gain quite an interesting understanding of history and cultural history, going back to what I was talking about, from the stories that people tell, because that is, if I'm thinking less about Africa here, but more about if you read some of the Chinese stories and myths and folklore, particularly about the stars, in actual fact, because what we see as a particular star constellation, Chinese astronomers would see it quite differently, and it will be the sort of the court of heaven, and these are this particular group of bureaucrats and this particular group of chancellors and things like that. So it's fascinating to see how they interpret that, whereas opposed to the Greek interpretation of the constellations, which revolves around the heroes, the gods, and their mighty deeds, if you like. So there's a lot to be said, I think, for looking at other cultures and other ways of seeing stories. And I think some of the best work I've seen on this was actually some of the work that was done by Idris Shah, who has done a lot, who did a lot of collecting of folk tales. I mean, he's most known for his work on The Way of the Sufi, but I think the fact that he actually spent a lot of time collecting folk tales and comparing them, and it's fascinating. This is something I wanted to say when we were talking about the stories of Ireland and of the Celtic fringe of the British Isles, which is that they are, although you'll find a particular twist on a particular story, you'll hear it from an Irish storyteller, but you'll probably hear the same story from an African storyteller and from an Asian storyteller, just adapted in a certain way. And I think that's the other thing that shows that these stories are individual and of themselves, is that they travel across continents and across cultures and change themselves relatively little in the process.
Yeah. There are also elements that get repeated. For example, I don't know if Destina, you had the same feeling, but when Julian, you were telling about the basket with the darkness inside, I don't know why, but my mind connected it to the myth of Pandora.
Cool.
And same thing with now that you mentioned Anansi, there's the story of Anansi and the box of stories, and so he collects all the stories, and then the box falls down, and all the stories get spread into the world. And
yes,
there are elements that get repeated of things being fitted inside a state that is way too little for them, and then them spreading out in the world.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? There's a theme of the box as almost like a character in stories, that it is an object of concealment and containment, and what is inside it is the fascinating thing. And there's a story I often tell, which is actually grim, a Grimm's story, about a boy who has to go out in a really cold night to find wood and pack it on the sledge. And as he sits to rest under a tree, he finds a golden key under this tree, under the snow, and he searches around until he finds a lock for it to fit. And he eventually finds, amongst all the snow, a box very ornately worked with metals and jewels on it, and it's got a tiny keyhole. And he turns the key, because it fits, he turns the key, and then the story says, and then we must wait until he opens it to see what is inside. And the story just stops dead there. And it's such a wonderful way. If I'm telling more than one story, I will quite often end the evening with that, because it's just a complete cliffhanger. It's like, okay, over to you. What's inside?
That's a very good idea for us to use with our students and have them, creatively think about what's coming next. But on the subject that you were mentioning earlier about places that are not, whose stories are not heard of often, there is this thing, well, there is always the question of cultural appropriation. There is this issue, some people raise it, and
Yes.
it is a very debatable subject. I think that the reason why I like people from different backgrounds tell stories from other cultures is that we do some work on it. First, we try to understand the other culture. We do some research. We don't just grab a story and retell it, we're losing important elements. And this is why I told you that I do like listening to Greek myths from other people. I mean, it seems outrageous to me that only Greeks would have the right to tell their myths, right? It's not like statues that should remain in the country. I mean, this is cultural heritage, isn't it? And it belongs to humanity.
Absolutely. And I think you're right. And I think it comes back to respecting the story as much as anything, what you were saying earlier. And I think, it did always, it crossed my mind with that particular story, The Basket of Darkness, as it does with sort of any story, which is not from what I might call my culture. Do I really have the right to tell this story? And the answer is usually yes, provided I tell it with sufficient respect and sufficient credit. I think there is I think we've spoken earlier about how stories have a life outside of their own. I think the best example of this is the story which is best known as Cinderella, which has, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of different variants, going back to about 2,500 BC. I think the earliest one is recorded in, I think it's ancient Egypt, but it is ultimately very, very human to tell stories. It's almost like telling, I suppose, yes, the difference, I think, in some ways is between sharing a joke which everybody can enjoy and sharing a joke which pokes fun at somebody. So, if I tell a joke in which somebody is which people are going to laugh at and they're going to share in, that's fine. But if I tell a joke which is I don't know, racist or something like that, that is wrong. I don't know that I'm making a lot of sense here, but it's kind of this question of cultural appropriation revolves around respect for the story, respect and understanding for the culture where it comes that it comes from, and not necessarily trying to impose your own attitudes on the story. I mean, I think the idea of in that story of a darkness being created by a deity and being carried by a bat, and then the bat loses it and tries to flap it back into the box. Well, we can all relate to that. It's not a specific particular element, that there isn't a specific particular element which I think is necessarily unique to Sierra Leone in that story. And so you can take that elsewhere if you want to. But if there had been particular story, there are particular stories which are very clearly have sort of cultural references and things like that. And in particular, I think in some of the African mythology I've read, there are things about the thrones and stools and things like that. And Nancy is a clear example of a trickster who is uniquely identified with West African mythology, and you wouldn't necessarily want to make any changes to that. But it's always a difficult question to answer, and I think everybody always has a different answer to it, and you need to respect people's different opinions on that sort of thing.
Yes, indeed, and it is a questionable matter. I mean, we have discussed it before, Simon. I can understand how some peoples, in particular the ones that have been colonized, might have more of an issue when it comes to their traditional tales. for example, the First Nations in the US and Canada, they want to hold on to their heritage, so that makes sense. But then again, I love Anansi stories, as you said earlier, and I also love Brer Rabbit stories. I love those.
Yes.
And those come with African people when they were transferred to the US as slaves. Unfortunately, this is a very dark page of humanity, but Brer Rabbit stories reflect that time and those circumstances. And I think it's really important that different nationalities of storytellers retell those tales, because this is how we empathize with the people. This is how we try their shoes.
Yes.
I think it's
Absolutely.
quite the opposite. If you did respect, I think respect is the word. That is all
Yes.
it takes.
Yes. Respect for the story, respect for the culture, and respect for the experience it comes from. I I would not easily be happy telling Brer Rabbit or any African American stories myself, because I don't feel I have the sort of the, if you like, the cultural grounding to do it. I love also telling I love reading some of the Yiddish folk tales, from the Jewish diaspora. But at the same time, I would be hesitant to actually tell them myself, because I think, again, they have that particular cultural grounding, which, me as a white European, it's a possibly, I think it strays a little bit into the realms of cultural appropriation. Now, I say that one of my favorite stories, and one of the first stories I actually told, when I was sort of learning, was a story called The Sword of Wood, which is a specifically Jewish story. But in actual fact, that was on a storytelling course that I went to at Emerson College, and I was fortunate. I don't know how it happened. We were telling stories as a duo, and it just so happened that the other person I was telling this story with was a Jewish woman, who understood all the background and all the sort of the tradition and the pronunciations, and exactly what was going on, and she completely got it. And whilst I think, I will still tell that story from time to time, because it's a lovely story, I think also there's an element to which I think that taught me that, because this is a cultural thing which she was so in tune with, there are elements in this story which I just do not get, and which are sort of in her blood, quite literally, and not in mine. So, the question then becomes, am I going to do this story justice by telling it? And if not, okay, there's always another story to tell.
I have tried some stories from the Hebrew heritage. I have tried telling them to friends from the US who happen to have the same origin in their families, and they were very well received. And not only that, talking about the stories afterwards helped me understand things that get lost in translation, of course.
Yes, and I think that's the thing. Things do get lost in translation, and yes, there are cultural points that I don't think anybody's going to mind if you're telling us if you're telling the story from a different culture, provided you're respectful to it, as I say. But at the same time, there is always that worry that you're just missing some of the story beats, and therefore not doing the story justice. That's my take on it. So I won't say I stay in my lane, but I do tend to have that in mind if a story comes up where I think I don't quite get this. It's an interesting conundrum.
It is. And then there's the other side of the coin, which is white guilt. And I think we suffer from it
Yes.
occasionally, even though we haven't colonized anyone personally. As you said, the white European sometimes feels that way when it comes to other cultures.
Yeah, and I think it's being, I think it's being aware of the inheritance and the heritage that you have knowingly or unknowingly inherited. I think the phrase "check your privilege" is used to sort of easily, but I do think it makes a reasonable point that, you know, if I'm looking at a story and I'm getting invested in a story, where has it come from? Why have I got a particular take on a story? You know, how is my own life experience? I'm not going to say prejudices, but how is my own life experience coloring that story? And I think inevitably, as a storyteller, that is something which you can and should be bringing to a story. But at the same time, you know, it comes back to paying respect to the story and its own tradition. Is this going in a direction which feels right? It's almost like sort of sympathetically renovating a house which other people have lived in, if you like. It's you know, it doesn't have to be a cultural thing. It can just be, okay, is this a house that, you know, is this going to help the house? Is it going to make it better? That sort of thing. And you know, and there are at the same time, there are stories which I've seen in the British or the English storytelling tradition, which I think should just go. To be perfectly honest, there are some which I'm quite happy to let disappear, because I think some of the attitudes that they carry about, you know, particularly about attitudes towards women, are just ones which, okay, just don't really have a place anymore. You know, we can talk about them, but you know, it's sometimes a little bit uncomfortable. I think the tendency that a lot of storytellers have to renovate stories in a way so that the princess is not the helpless victim, but it has her own agency, is something that is a response to the increasing consideration of feminism and how it affects society and how it inevitably affects storytelling. Now, that's a much bigger subject, which you know, I have an only limited qualification to talk on, but I think it's a reflection of how, you know, stories evolve and match their audiences. So the audiences play into the story. You know, if they don't want to hear about helpless princesses being kidnapped and rescued by handsome knights, okay, well, there's a difference. That's how the story is evolving, because of the audience. It's an
It's
endless
not,
story, and it's an endless process, and it's absolutely fascinating.
it's not just that. It's not just a helpless princess. I mean, every time I have to tell, I choose to tell another myth with a hero that is one of Zeus's illegitimate offspring. There is such an internal struggle always. You know, I have to put my feminism aside and look at it through a different lens. Otherwise, I will suffer. I will not be able to tell the myth. And concerning your lovely metaphor, I love that one with a house. You're renovating a house that's passed to your hands. As long as you haven't kicked anybody out of the house, I think it's okay.
I think that's a really good way of putting it. Yes, absolutely right. Yes.
As time flies, I have to ask, is there any story that's agonizingly asking to be told?
Let me tell the first story I ever learned to tell properly, which is The Sword of Wood. And as I say, it's a particular favourite of mine. And it came to me from a course I was doing, but it's also a very strong story, I think, which is all about healing the masculine soul as well. And the story goes that there was a king who was liked to think that he was very much in touch with his people. And to do this, he would disguise himself and go out into the world, into his city, and he would disguise himself and talk to people, and they never knew he was the king. And one night he did this, and he went to the very poorest part of his city, and he went to the Jewish quarter. There was a great deal of poverty there. And he looked at the various houses, and little more than shacks, some of them. And in the very poorest street, at the end of the very poorest street, at the very poorest little tumble down shack, barely holding together, he heard a sound of singing, not miserable singing, not sad singing, but joyful singing, coming from this shack. And he was fascinated. So he went and knocked on the door. And a voice from inside said, "Ah, a stranger is a blessing from God, a friend who is to be. Come in and join me." And inside was a man sitting on a box. No other furniture, just this box. And the man said, come in, my friend, come in. As you can see, I have very little furniture, but here, sit down on this, and we will talk. And the man was very welcoming. So the king sat down, and they talked, and the king said, I heard you singing from outside. What are you singing about? Why are you so happy? And he said, well, yeah, I have enough. I do my work during the day. It gives me enough to eat. I come back and I sing with joy, for my life is fine. My life is everything I need it to be. Now, the king, who lived in a marvelous palace with every want possibly catered for at his merest raise of an eyebrow, was amazed by this. He really couldn't relate to this at all. So he said to the man, but what is it you do? What is your job? And he said, I am a shoe repairer. I'm a cobbler. And the king said, so you have a shop? And he said, no, said the man, no, I have no shop. I'm not that rich. No, what I have is this box. And he opened the box and showed him all his cobbling tools. What I do is I go and I sit at the side of the street and I tell people if they need their shoes repaired, they come to me, I repair their shoes. And this way I make enough money to feed myself for the evening. And then the next day I start again. And in the evening I come back here and I rest and I sing with my joy of life. Well, it's been lovely meeting you, said the king. I must go now. And the reason the king had to go so quickly was because he was very, very confused. This had given him a lot to think about. So he thought to himself, well, I wonder if he would be so happy if he wasn't able to make so much money. Because in some ways, the king was slightly upset at the idea that somebody could have so little and be so happy. It kind of challenged the king's worldview. So that night, he wrote a proclamation and ordered it to be declared throughout the city, saying that nobody was to trade at the side of the road unless they had bought a license from the palace, which would be quite expensive. And he ordered that to be sung throughout, to be shouted throughout the city. And the next night, he put back on his same disguise and went to see the man. He thought, right, I wonder how he's coped with that. And as he approached the hut, he could hear the songs coming from it, just as joyful as before. And he knocked on the door and went in, and the man said, my friend, so good to see you again. Come in, sit down. And the king said to him, well, my friend, I wanted to see you because I hear there's been a proclamation which has stopped people working at the side of the road. And I was worried that this might affect your business. And the man said, I worried the same thing. But as I was wondering what to do, I ran into some friends of mine and they said, look, we're going out to the woodlands to cut some wood. We'll bring it back. We'll sell it. That way we're not selling at the side of the street. We don't have to pay for the license. We'll be fine. So I did that. And I cut some wood. I brought it back to the city. I sold it. I got enough money to make for my evening meal. And here I am again, singing for my joy of life. Well, said the king, that's very good, I guess. And wandered off, went back to the palace, made another proclamation, determined to challenge this a bit further. And he said that this new proclamation said that anybody who was found cutting wood in the forest without a license would be forcibly inducted into the city's guard, the army, the militia. And so having done that, he sat and waited. And then the next evening, he went back to the man's hut. And sure enough, as he approached it, he heard the songs coming through again. And he knocked on the door, was invited in, and saw the man sat there and in a full military uniform. And he said to the man, well, I was going to ask what happened to you because I heard about the new proclamation, but I can see you've been invited into the guard. Well, I don't say I was invited, said the man, but here I am. It's what the world wants from me. It's what God wants me to do. And so I'm happy. But surely, said the king, when you join the guard, you don't get paid until the end of the first month you've worked there. So how will you make money? How will you live? How will you feed yourself? Aha, said the man. It's funny you asked that. Because you see, when you join the guard, they give you a sword. Now, this sword is made of metal. Metal is valuable. So what I did was I removed the blade and I replaced it with a blade made of wood. And I took the blade to the pawnbroker and he gave me plenty of money for it. At the end of the month, when I get paid, I'll reclaim the blade, I'll put it back. Nobody will know. In the meantime, I've got this wooden sword in my scabbard. Nobody's going to be any the wiser. But surely, said the king, if you have to take the sword out, then what are you going to do? Oh, I don't think that'll happen, said the man. It's a peaceful world, and if it does, well, God will provide. So the king went back to the palace that night, even more determined to push this situation and see what he could do. And so the next morning, he assembled all of the city guard, including his friend, in front of the palace, and he brought out a convicted criminal, a man who'd been convicted of murder. And he addressed them all. He said, "Guard, this man has been convicted of murder and is to be executed. He's to be put to death now, here, today, by one of you, and I will choose who will do it." And of course, the king, unrecognizable without wearing his disguise, walked up and down the ranks of the city guard until he came to, of course, his friend. He touched him on the shoulder and said, You're one of our new recruits. Take your sword and cut this man's head off." And so the man went over to the convicted criminal and stood before him, clearly very worried. And he said, "My king, I am a very religious man, and my religion forbids me to take life in any other way other than self-defense. I cannot do this." And the king said, "Well, if you don't do it, you'll be put to death yourself. There, how's that for self-defense for you?" He said, "My king, that's not good enough. The God I worship will not allow that." And the king said, "Never mind, get on with it. It's an order." And the man thought for a moment, and he put his hand on his sword, trembling. And he said in a loud and clear voice, "Oh Lord, you know that I would not do this. You know that I would not do this if I were not being ordered, and it is not my will, for I follow you and obey you in all things. Therefore, if it is not your will that I should do this, I beg you that when I draw this sword out, it be changed from sharp metal to useless wood." And he brandished the sword out, and sure enough, the crowd gasped because lo and behold, his sword had been changed from terrible sharp metal into a useless sword of wood. A miracle. And the king realized at that point that the man had a much, much better way of living than himself. And he said to him, "I'm going to reveal myself to you. This is my secret. I am the man who's been visiting you these last 3 nights. I've been testing you. It has been wrong of me. And you've shown me so much. I want you to leave the shack where you live, and I want you to come and live with me in the palace and show me how to live as you do, just taking what you need and no more, and enjoying life day to day." And they joined hands, and the king joined in with the song of the man for the first time, and they went back into the palace together.
Yay. That's a wonderful story, Julian.
It's a lovely
Every
story, isn't
time
it?
I hear it, it's just I love stories about people that are positive through hard times, and then I think when a story gives this message and it's also fun to listen
Yes,
to, because at the end it's he's just so clever, and the ending of the story, it makes you laugh because you say, "Oh, he's so clever, he's so clever," and that's brilliant. But it leaves you with a positive message.
it does. It really
I
does.
never, I never thought of that story as healing toxic masculinity, but now that you put it that way, I can see it quite clearly.
Yeah, it really does. It really does. It's perhaps overconsumption more than toxic masculinity, but it's lovely just the same.
Well, it is envy. It has to.
Yes, yes.
Well,
Thank you so much, Julian, for coming on the podcast. It was a real pleasure for me to get to know you. And I'm sure for Despina to meet you again and
Yes.
have a chance to talk.
It's been really good fun. Thank you so much for inviting me.
and you for giving away your time and your stories.
No problem. My pleasure. My absolute pleasure.